licensed clinical Susan Kahan is a licensed clinical professional counselor and psychotherapist at the University of Illinois at Chicago with a focus on developmental disability and trauma. She provides individual and group therapy for children and adults on a broad range of mental health and developmental and behavioral concerns, and provides consultation and training for trauma centers, disability agencies, professionals, schools, and families on disability-related topics, including healthy sexuality and relationships, sexual abuse prevention, and trauma intervention. We really appreciate her willingness to share her time and her expertise with our group today. So please help me welcome Susan Kahan.
Hi, thanks for having me today. It's so nice to see that there's so many people sort of focusing on this topic, and I appreciate that your group has taken an interest in it. We see there are all kinds of reasons why it's really important as parents, professionals, and caregivers that we kind of focus on this topic because, first of all, human sexuality is a part of being human. And, you know, when we think about individuals with disabilities, we want to really be careful about too much otherizing, right? Too much thinking about people with disabilities as something different than, other than us, right? And that sort of gets to that issue of the medical model of disability versus the social model of disability. So the medical model is the model we are sort of historically thinking about disability, where there's something kind of broken in a person. There's something that's different, not right, that needs to be fixed. And our goal as caregivers, as professionals, to help them fix that, to make them as, quote, normal as possible. The social model of disability says that our disability, any disability, exists in relationship to the environment. It exists in relationship to others, right? It's the extent to which society has chosen in its current form to only accommodate some of its people, not all of its people. Society ought to incorporate all humans, and humans exist on a spectrum in all kinds of ways. And the spectrum of disability is pretty broad, right? All of us over the course of a lifetime will experience disability at some point in a permanent or maybe a temporary acquired form, but it's just a piece of being human. So when we recognize that disability is part of the human condition, it's part of the spectrum of humanity, we can also then maybe refocus ourselves on the idea that sexuality is part of being a human, right? It shouldn't be limited necessarily to just part of society. It is certainly a part of the human body, but it's also part of the human mind. It's part of human nature to want to connect, both in terms of friendships, but also with intimacy with other humans. And so let's try to keep that in the front of our mind, right? And that's kind of the mindset that I want to start at. So this is the tricky part for me, trying to get all the technology to work properly. So I'm going to make a big effort here to move things around on my son built me a computer. It's basically a giant command center that I could run the world from here. People probably aren't aware of that, but I could. But it makes it tricky. All right, I'm going to share my screen. I think I've got it. So now I can see you and the chat and you. All right, is that working? Yeah, awesome. All right, so now I can see the chat, and I can see you, and I can see my PowerPoint. Okay, so healthy sexuality and healthy relationships. That's our job for today, right? We're going to contemplate these really important topics as humans. So what are our goals? Our goal, understand the myths and misperceptions about individuals with intellectual and developmental disability, and how those myths and misperceptions can impact access to education on healthy sexuality and relationships. we're going to think about identifying some tools and strategies for teaching individuals with IDD about healthy relationships and sexuality, and then also understand the role of healthy relationships and sexuality education as a primary sexual abuse prevention strategy. My primary work, I'm a mental health therapist. I work with children through adults with developmental disability, autism in particular, but all developmental disabilities. And my area of expertise is trauma. And so I do think about this a lot, and I do worry about it a lot. And so it does get thrown into all my presentations, but I also think that it's important to contemplate, because as I'm going to say later, if you don't recognize what's healthy, how are you supposed to recognize what's not healthy? So we need to think about healthy sexuality education and education on healthy relationships as really an important safety issue, as well as an important part of just appropriate education for humans. All right, if you're wondering why I'm looking that way, it's because now you're over there, but my PowerPoint's over here. All right, sexuality and disability, some of the myths that we deal with, sort of, as I'm a parent of an adult with autism. And so, you know, this is a topic I have to think about as well, right? So some of the things that the myths that come up in society with regard to disability, right? People with disabilities are asexual or hypersexual, right? As parents, as caregivers, we tend to look at individuals with disability as just big kids, particularly if they have an intellectual disability. They're just big kids, right? I had a client who got herself into some difficulty in terms of sexual activity at the clinic, and with another client. It was kind of an interesting encounter. But when I called her mother to ask her, to tell her what had happened and to ask her what kind of sexuality education did her daughter have? Her daughter was 34 years old. And mom's response to me was, you have to understand, to you, she's a 34-year-old woman, but to me, she's still my little 12-year-old girl, right? And I do think that a lot of us as parents and as caregivers have that kind of mindset when we look at our kids. Honestly, I also have a son who does not have a disability, and I kind of think of him the same way. So it's kind of a big hurdle to overcome, but it certainly is a hurdle that's necessary to overcome. These are adults, right? We're talking often about adults, or we're talking about children who are going to grow into adults, and adult bodies with adult feelings and adult hormones, and that adult human brain that craves relationship, craves intimacy. That is going to be a part of that adult human body, right? So trying to think of people as asexual, as just big kids, is a barrier that we're putting on ourselves. Sometimes we have the other problem, which is that people look at people with a disability and think of them as probably hypersexual. That's one of the reasons sometimes why it's hard to get a group home into a neighborhood, is because they're afraid for their, young girls. I think one thing we're going to talk about is teaching boundaries, right? Teaching about appropriate education and boundaries. People with DD are no more hypersexual typically than the rest of us. It's just that they have those feelings, but they haven't been taught appropriate boundaries. People with physical disabilities are unable to have sex. Right? Sometimes we'll look at somebody who has a significant physical disability and say, well, they could never have sex anyways. There's a whole industry that's actually cropped up around tools and strategies to assist people with physical disabilities in having sex. So that's simply not the case. People with disabilities have more important things than sex to worry about. And I have actually heard parents say this to their kids in the context of some of my work. The kids will bring up relationships, and mom's response will be, oh, we've got bigger fish to fry, right? So the fact is, sexuality, just like for all other humans, is going to come up in the minds of particularly adolescents, and then adults, when we fail to provide opportunities for healthy relationships, opportunities to learn about healthy sexuality. Some of the other myths: people with disabilities don't get sexually assaulted. And there's a lot of reasons why people think that, but a lot of it is, oh no, there's so many people watching over them that they don't have, strangers don't have access to them. But one thing we know is that most sexual abuse occurs at the hands of somebody you know and trust. And that applies not only to children, that applies to adults as well. And people with disabilities often have even more people responsible for their care, and often with more hands-on responsibility. And so we need to be very aware that people with disabilities have vulnerabilities, sometimes in excess of what a typically developing person might have with regard to sexual abuse or sexual assault. People with disabilities don't need sex education. Why? Because they're not going to have sex anyway. People with disabilities should only marry and have sexual relationships with other people with disabilities. There are a lot of ways that people judge appropriateness for partners, right? But the most important thing is personal connection. We sometimes, there are different ways we think about sort of power dynamics in relationships, right? If you have somebody with an intellectual disability and somebody without an intellectual disability, there's a lot of disparity in their ability to sort of understand actions and consequences or relationships. There is opportunity in that setting for an unhealthy power relationship to occur, but you know what? That's all the more reason for educating people on healthy relationships in addition to healthy sexuality. We need to really be aware about power dynamics in a relationship. People with disabilities should not have children. People with disabilities do sometimes have children. I just did a presentation with a developmental pediatrician in Wisconsin on their, actually, I guess it was Michigan, on their home visitors program there, where specifically on providing support for parents with developmental disability. So we can, that needs to be a part of how we think, and what kind of supports do we have. Having children is also, just such an important part for so many humans in their own lives. Can we provide the kind of supports that people need? Do we provide them? What do we need to do to make sure that they're available for people with disabilities, particularly intellectual and developmental disabilities who do have children? This is how I start, right? If we don't know what a healthy relationship looks like, how will we recognize an unhealthy relationship? It's just the most important element of this in my mind. People crave relationships, humans crave relationships, and we really want those relationships to be healthy because we know they're going to happen, at least in terms of friendship and sometimes in terms of intimacy. We need to make sure that people have a really healthy understanding of what is a friend. What is the difference between a friend and an acquaintance? What is the difference between an acquaintance and a stranger? What's the difference between a friend and a family member? Staff and friends, staff and family. There's so many different kind of relationships, and we can be doing a lot of training around all the different kinds of relationships, and then the appropriateness of different kinds of touch within those relationships, right? And we've got some tools we can use to help work on that. What we don't want is to wait until it becomes a problem before we start to address it, right? Which often is the case. So thank you all for coming today, because hopefully you're all here because it's not a problem. You'd like to head off problems. For a lot of us, there are problems that have come up, and hopefully we can have some ideas for that as well. All right, so why is sex ed important? Sexual development is natural and in most cases inevitable, right? It's part of the human body. And so there's some acceptance that has to happen on the part of parents, caregivers, professionals, that sexuality is something that we're going to have to deal with, that that person is going to experience over time. Promotes positive body image, self-confidence, and communication. If we're not, if sexuality is such a taboo topic in your house, what is your person supposed to do when they have questions, when they have feelings that they don't understand, right? If they feel like anything having to do with the private parts on my body is something we don't talk about, that's going to be a problem. I was speaking at the National Society for Down Syndrome at their conference a couple of years ago. And it's a fabulous conference. There's a lot of adults with Down syndrome who attend the conference as self-advocates. There's also a lot of family members there. And I was doing actually this very talk. In the context of that, I said the word penis. And a bunch of the adults with Down syndrome went, oh, she said penis. She said a bad word. Well, when did that become a bad word, right? There's a big part of that audience was men who think that the word penis, the part of their body, is a bad word. This is problematic, right? What if they have questions? We're teaching them that the parts of their body are negative, are things to be kept hidden, right? So let's be really aware of the message that we're giving, the message that we're giving our people and society when we sort of act on the sort of myths and misperceptions that we all tend to have in our head someplace, and we aren't more thoughtful about what we're teaching our children about their body, about sexual development, about other people's bodies and other people's development, right? So that they can have good boundaries, so that they can have better understandings of themselves and of relationships, because they'll have a little better perspective of what all this means for other people, right? We have issues of consent, for example, right? So it also facilitates healthy relationships. If you don't know what's healthy, how are you going to know what's unhealthy, right? And so to the extent that people experience sexual feelings towards someone else, we need them to be able to understand those feelings in the context of relationships, and not just have this idea that they can act on those feelings whenever they happen, or that they could pressure somebody or trick somebody into satisfying those sexual feelings in their own body. Promotes health and hygiene. I don't know, I have boys. I'll tell you what, there was a lot of discussion around health and hygiene and also sexuality with the boys. Like, I didn't have girls, but I am a girl. I do recall a lot of conversations with my mother on this topic as well. You know, teenagers are gross. They're just gross. College students, gross. Young adults, ew, they smell bad. You know, like, we got to just do a lot more work generally on health and hygiene, but also as it pertains to puberty, sexuality. As I said, it's a primary prevention for sexual abuse. In the event of abuse, it helps children and adults navigate the disclosure and the forensic interview process. So if somebody does experience abuse, if somebody touches them in a way that they're not comfortable with, if somebody scares them, if somebody takes advantage of them, they need to be able to tell somebody, which means they need to have the words for it, no matter what their communication style is, right? And here's something, the forensic interview process is that process of where law enforcement gets a statement. And there are in this, in the Chicago area, there are forensic interviewers specially trained to interview sensitively and appropriately people with developmental disability and autism. In fact, I consult with the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center's forensic interviews on cases involving people with developmental disability. They're very good, and they will do courtesy interviews for adults. So what we need, though, is for children and adults to have the words, have the words to express when somebody touches them and they don't like it, somebody scares them, they're uncomfortable in a relationship, so that they know so that they can express that to somebody. Often we see that discomfort in the form of behavior. People just get agitated and scared and start refusing to go someplace or go with somebody. We want them to have words to say, and we want them to feel comfortable, right? What signals have we been giving them with regard to our comfort in hearing them talk about their sexuality or the things that make them uncomfortable? That's what we want, is them to feel comfortable to say, Mama, I'm worried about something. You know, Dad, somebody hurt me, somebody made me uncomfortable, right? Can we talk about that? For those of you who have children using assistive communication devices, one of the issues, the legal issues that comes up, is that if you don't have the words already in the assistive communication device before they give a statement, it can be very difficult, because if you add additional pictures, that could be considered leading, like a leading question. And so you want to make sure that you have in your assisted communication device, for example, all of the images or words pertaining to people's bodies, pertaining to different kinds of touch, pertaining to how to express that somebody hurt me, somebody made me uncomfortable, somebody touched my penis and I didn't want them to, right? They need to have that kind of language available to them before or in the event that something goes wrong, you know? So that's just an important thing to consider. And though that language is going to be important over a lifetime. One thing we know is that students in special education classes are often excluded from sex education in school. Sometimes it's because that's a convenient time for the school to do a pullout. A lot of times people assume they don't have appropriately modified materials. I had a nurse at a conference I was doing once. She was very proud of herself. She raised her hand and said, "Oh, I'm the one who does sex ed at my school." And I have always made sure to include all of the special ed students. And then she added, "Oh, well, of course, I take them out for the part on sexually transmitted diseases, but the rest of it, they're there for." I'm like, oh my God, you take them out? Like, why? Of all the parts about sexuality does she take them out of? She takes them out of a really important conversation on safety and potential consequences of sexual interaction, right? Sexually transmitted diseases. People, kids, adults need to know that is a pot. They need to know how to keep themselves safe. But she takes them out for that part. I'm not really clear why. You know what that says to me is that she doesn't really believe they're going to have sex. She was very proud of herself for providing sex education, but she didn't really believe that they were going to have sex. Because if she does, why is she taking them out for this really important element of potential consequences of behavior and how do I keep myself safe? So really thinking about that. If students in school aren't getting sex ed, are they getting it at home? You know, if we were all in person, I would ask you to raise your hand, and anybody whose mom was or dad were the first ones who taught them about sex. And usually I get like 3 people in an audience of 100, right? Yeah, it's usually like an older sibling, a cousin. I learned about it in the pine tree in the O'Brien's backyard from Anne Marie, who was 9 and I was 8, you know, like, and her thing was, you know how you do it? He puts his in yours. I didn't know what his was. I didn't know what mine was, but I wanted nothing to do with whatever that was. But that was my sex education until later, when my cousin, I think in retrospect, was trying to teach me about condoms. But in my head, somehow sex involved blue balloons. It's just showing you, I was a good little Catholic girl and we did not discuss sex. But boy, did I grow up with a lot of misconceptions until admittedly much later than it should have been. So we need to get that information in there. We need to be sharing that information. Because we can't be confident that the schools are, and as parents sometimes we're like, well, they're going to get that in school, at least I don't have to talk about it. But again, if we as parents and caregivers aren't sharing that information, we're not giving a signal to our kids that we're somebody who can talk about, who can talk comfortably with them about questions that they have about their own bodies or about sexuality or about things they hear in the O'Brien's pine tree, right? Children with disabilities are also less likely to benefit from environmental learning. Again, kids are talking about sex all the time. And you know our kids are listening too. We want them to get the right information, right? But a lot of that conversation, it's a kind of important conversation too, because it has, they're learning things from that, right? They're hearing the conversations where kids are talking about touch, appropriate touch, what's comfortable, what's not comfortable. One thing I like to contemplate is, so why do toddlers spend so much time like in a little balls with each other rolling around the floor like tiger cubs, right? They're just like constantly all over each other. Why? That's kind of practice touch. That's where they're learning what's okay with them and what is not okay with them, but also what's okay with other people and what's not okay with other people. Well, that kind of practice touch continues right through teenage. Like I actually took the door off my basement because once my boys were teenagers, every time I walked by the basement and looked down, there was like a pile of entwined limbs down there. So they're watching a movie and everybody's got heads in laps, and like teenagers exist in clumps too. Teenagers are constantly touching each other, not always in a sexual way, but again, this is practice touch. This is where they're learning to say yes and they're learning to say no. And equally importantly, they're learning to hear yes and they're learning to hear no. So our kids aren't invited to those parties sometimes. A lot of them are on behavior plans where they're learning hands to self, hands to self, hands to self. When my son was in first grade, I was mom helper, and the kids were lining up in the classroom to go to an event. And they had learned that the way you can tell if you're far enough, if you're standing far enough from away, a respectful distance from somebody else, is that you should be able to bend over and see your toes. If you can't bend over and see your toes without knocking the person in front of you, you're too close. So they lined up and the teacher said, "Can you see your toes?" And what did the whole line of first graders do? Boom, they slammed their heads on the backs of the people in front of them, right? Not unexpected. And the teacher's response was, "Oh, now come on. Everybody back up, stop that. You know better than," right? Except my son, who had an aide, who pulled him out of line and said, "George, you know better of that. No touching," right? Well, this is something we see quite a bit. Over-behaviorizing, I don't know, whatever the word is, our kids, right? Overtraining them against natural touch, natural interaction with kids, right? They got to be kids. That touch, that practice touch is really so important. Should they be slamming their heads on the back of something? No, but appropriate instruction is appropriate, not pulling them out, shaming them, frowny face on your behavior plan, no M&Ms at lunch. It needs to be instructive, a skill building approach to these interactions. Direct teaching, but in a skill building way, not in a shaming way. Somebody says, what about touching and the perception of inappropriateness during routine hygiene practices? This is such an important and excellent question because we have so many people who have others helping them with hygiene, dressing, even things like getting a coat on to go outside, right? This is caregivers who are also in the context of a lot of therapies, right? People are hands-on with somebody. We teach appropriate boundaries. We teach people the right to bodily autonomy, the right to say no. And then, but there are times where it's not going to be a choice, particularly if it's around safety and health. So the important part there is that we talk about appropriate boundaries and explain why this is an exception, right? It's all about the conversation. These touching somebody when they have indicated that they don't want to be touched. It's really important because that we have a conversation every time that happens, so that they are always having in their head that I have a right to, at a minimum, a conversation around this topic. Can I go outside in 20 below weather with no jacket on? No, that's not safe. And my mom is going to put me in a jacket whether I want her to or not, because she can't let me get hurt. That's her job, is to keep me safe. If I need help with hygiene, right, that's a matter of health and safety, that somebody is clean, particularly after toileting, for example. So there's a conversation that happens with that. And it doesn't, we try not to engage in those activities without that conversation, because we don't want people to internalize the idea that their body doesn't belong to them, that they don't have a right to say no, or a right at least to understand why there's a difference. And they then have the words to explain to a parent or caregiver when somebody violates those boundaries and they're not comfortable with the reason. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense.
Susan, can I interject? There was a question here very much on point with this, is what about touching and the perception of inappropriateness during the routine hygiene practices, showering, bathing, etc. So if someone is helping that person, what specifically should the conversation be before they would assist them?
I would say something like, I mean, this all depends on the individual, but I would probably say something like, you're finished toileting and now we need to wipe. Can I help you wipe? And if the answer is no, I would say, all right, can you wipe yourself? If they can't wipe themselves, I would say, well, we need to make sure you're clean. And normally, the rule is that you're in charge of your own body, but we also have to be careful about safety and health, and making sure that you're clean after toileting is important. So I'm going to help you wipe. But thank you for telling me that you're uncomfortable. Right now, if I say something like that, if other people have ideas, they might feel free to jump in. Because I want them then, if they're, say, I'm the aide at school, I want them to be able to go home and say to their mom, if they're uncomfortable with that, or to their dad, like, somebody was helping me wipe today and I didn't like the way she did it, or she didn't ask me first, she shouldn't touch me with that, or whatever, right? I want them to know that there is a rule about this, and there's also rules about safety and health. Right.
Okay.
So
Thank you. Yes,
trying
that's
to integrate those two ideas, because it's tough. It is tough. All right. So how do you know when to approach the topic? Normally I would ask, when do you approach the topic? But since we're not in person, and one of these days we will be, I would say the day they're born, right? Sometimes people say, well, when they're 10, when they're 9, when they're 16. I would say we approach it the day they're born by naming their body parts by their actual name, right? Call it a penis, not a wee-wee. We call it a vagina, not a front bum. I have a friend who's actually my sister-in-law, her dad was a physician, and he always just referred to girl parts as the front bum. Like, don't call it by that. You call it a vagina, right? We call things by their actual name. That promotes the idea that bodies are not something to be ashamed of. They're not something that we don't talk about. They're appropriate places, right? Private parts of bodies are appropriate for private conversations, not public conversations. But we talk about it and we name them by their name. Also, in the unfortunate situation where there is sexual abuse, for example, they have the words to explain what happened to them, right? How do we make the information accessible, right? And one thing, oftentimes, we have the idea of somebody's developmental age versus their chronological age. Well, she's 34, but I think of her as a 12-year-old girl, right? What we need to make sure that we're doing is teaching concepts at a chronological age, right? That a 34-year-old woman needs to know about her 34-year-old body and the feelings that come with a 34-year-old body and the urges that sometimes come with a 34-year-old body. But what we want to do is present material in a way that can be best understood, and that's where developmental age can be helpful, right? Somebody's learning style might be more in keeping with their developmental age, but the content is more in keeping with their chronological age. And we want to make sure that they're understanding our concepts, check and double check. I was working with a guy once on the idea of public versus private. He was a guy who was having sexual behavior problems because he had never learned appropriate boundaries. And we were just working on something as simple as public and private. And I couldn't understand why he was struggling. So some weeks he understood, some weeks he didn't really understand. And it turned out that he actually did get the idea of private for one person, public for a lot of people, but he didn't get the vocabulary. Public and private, they both start with P, they both have 2 syllables. He couldn't remember which word applied to which concept, except that that's really important, because if somebody tells you that's private, but in your head, private meant a lot of people because you just couldn't remember which word went to what, you're going to end up with problems. So checking and double checking that people are understanding the concepts that you're teaching. We know that a lot of our folks are good at looking like they understand what we're saying when they really have no idea, right? The smile and nod. We want to be really careful about that because these concepts are really important for safety reasons as well as for personal reasons. And so we want to make sure we're using literalism and not euphemism, right? We don't call it the birds and bees, we call it sexuality. We don't call, a body, a woman's vagina, her cookie, which I hear her taco, which is something that I just heard, because I can imagine, and I don't need to share with you the various ways that that euphemism can be used to take advantage of somebody, but also how difficult it would be then for that person to disclose to a parent or law enforcement if something went wrong, right? If somebody says they took a bite of my taco, well, that's going to cause a problem. All right. So how do when's the right opportunity, right? It's opportunities come up organically. If you're watching TV, like I know people who are like into like stop action TV. Every time there's like a relationship scene on TV, they'll stop the show and sort of like, oh, what do you think's going on there? We also use that a lot for theory of mind. What do you think he's thinking? What do you think she's thinking right now? Do you think she was comfortable with that? Look at her face, right? So some people will you can use just in the natural course of watching TV, as long as you don't ruin the show. Try not to ruin the show. Nobody wants to be interrupted too many times, then they're not going to listen to you, right? But there comes opportunities all the time for discussion and for topics to come up. And when you're the one who sort of leads the topic, that's you signaling to your child or the person you're working with that you're a person who's comfortable talking about this. If you're the one who brings up the topic from time to time, you're the one, you're giving such a good signal to them that they could bring it up and you'll be comfortable with that. Sometimes in the context of trauma, right? When I'm working with somebody after they've experienced sexual abuse, a big part of their trauma is their parents' reaction when they told them, right? That's what they're afraid of. That was the scariest part for them. And we want to make sure that we're able to have these conversations, even when they're hard, in a non-judgmental way, right? That we're not having a big reaction or, oh my God, reaction or angry reaction, right? We don't want to be embarrassed. Like, so practice saying penis and vagina in a mirror or something so you stop blushing. Service providers can help and support caregivers. So I think as service providers, a lot of us need to have conversations with, particularly around touch, with caregivers, making clear what our boundaries are going to be, right? Because we're always modeling good boundaries, and asking them what the boundaries in their household are. Maybe if they need help coming up with language to talk about that with their person, we could be there to do that for them. So as caregivers, we can play a really important role in issues around sexuality and relationships. And then the best, a lot of people struggle because they don't have the words, right? They'll say like, well, my mom didn't talk to me about that. My dad, I can't even think of how I would start that. So inform yourself, right? There are lots of books now out there. There's lots of online resources. Vanderbilt has a really good free online resource, Healthy Bodies for Boys, Healthy Bodies for Girls, Purity, Sex, and Sexuality. These are online resources. One of the at the end, there's a link to this, but you can also just Google it, Vanderbilt Healthy Bodies, right? And read that. It's got all kinds of great materials, and it can give you the words to think about and talk about sexuality with your person. why is it important that parents view themselves as primary educators here? Because you'll have, families have their own thoughts and boundaries around touch, around appropriateness in terms of sexuality and caregiving. We all do. And if you want the values of your family to be foremost in your person's mind, well, take the lead rather than complain when somebody talks about something that's uncomfortable for you. What would I hope is that every parent and caregiver recognizes that sexuality is a spectrum, it's a rainbow, and we want people to feel comfortable in whatever their sexuality is, but every family has its own set of values, and we want to, if that's important to you, be the primary education. Oh, just one other, make appropriate resources available to your person. So you see this, the book, It's Perfectly Normal. That's one of my very favorite resources. It's great. I think 10 and up. And a friend of mine, I grew up Catholic, right? This was the fact that I can say penis without blushing, that was practice. It's Perfectly Normal is a really great book. It presents sexuality in such a healthy, non-judgmental, it's got a nice sense of humor to it. It's cartoons, but it's cartoons about all body types, including bodies with disabilities. It's the language is pretty clear and easy. And a friend of mine, when my kids were sort of 7, 8, 9, were starting to notice the girls. A friend of mine said, the trick, you get this book, It's Perfectly Normal, and you leave it on the coffee table, and then it disappears, and then it reappears, a couple of weeks later. Awesome, right? Now the kids got good, appropriate information about sexuality in their bodies, and I read the book too, so now I can say, I noticed you were reading my book, do you have any questions, right? And so sure enough, I put the book out and it disappeared. And this friend of mine had a son the same age as mine. One day I heard him on the phone with his friend saying, yeah, but did you see page 35? I was like, well, I know they're going to talk about sex, so they might as well talk about healthy sexuality, right? But there are all kinds of books and resources available for children, and there are more and more available for young adults and adults with disabilities, physical disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are books about masturbation. That can be really important because people are going to masturbate whether you like it or not, right? I have had clients who hurt themselves because they don't know how to masturbate in a healthy, safe way. And so there are actually books on masturbation. There are whole curriculum that can be used. And so what are some of the key concepts that we want to make sure we're teaching? Privacy, right? Make sure that I try to remember there are 4 kinds of privacy, right? Public and private parts of your body, public and private things we say, public and private things we do, and public and private places. So we want to make sure we're talking about public and private across all of these areas of privacy. Boundaries and touch, different kinds of relationships have different boundaries and different appropriate touch, healthy versus unhealthy relationships, and consent. So let's talk about a little bit about each of those. Public versus private. I told you the struggle I had with one of my clients. He really did get this idea of private and public, but he couldn't remember which word attached to the concept. More commonly, I have the problem with the concept, but this time it was just the word. And it is confusing, right? Public bathrooms, are they public? Well, a lot of people are allowed to use them, but the stall is private, right? So can kids crawl under the stall? No, they cannot. No, they cannot. Can you bang on somebody's stall door when they're in there? Should you be chatting with somebody who's in there trying to take a poop? No, don't do that. That's gross and it's impolite, right? Public and private, we thinking about this, not just, there are the 4 main categories, but also the ways in which it can be confusing, right? And so thinking about all of those is going to be really important. So let's see. I want to make sure we have lots of time for discussion as appropriate, but this actually happened in I was doing an emotion regulation group with at a day program, and this happened. So let's have like a quick, throw some ideas up into the chat. Staff at a day program for adults come to you for advice on how to handle a tricky situation. One of the participants, a young man with Down syndrome, has been getting erections during the program. Staff notice that he comes to class every day wearing sweatpants. When the class is sitting down for an extended period of time, the young man has his hands in his lap and rocks in his chair. When he gets up, he has an erection, but he doesn't seem to notice or care. Other clients are both curious and alarmed, right? A lot of screaming happens. And he would actually do this in the context of my emotion regulation class. So this actually happened. What advice would you give staff? Throw some ideas into the chat here. I don't know, Barbara, can you see anything
We
coming
don't
up?
have anything yet. How about wear jeans,
Wear jeans, right?
right? Instead of sweatpants.
Sweatpants, easy access to your private parts. In this case, we suggested a heavy pair of jeans, right? I've had other people where we suggest overalls, like, because even the jeans were a problem. Try overalls, see if that helps. Like, you can be kind of creative. We've had, people figure out how to put the zipper for the pants in the back as needed, right? There are various ways that we can try to use compression underwear. Excellent idea. And I've heard of people doing that as well. There are a lot of ways in which you can sort of think about this, but this is not an uncommon problem. And it's not just for adults. This was an adult program, but we have this problem with kids, particularly, when they're in the throes of puberty. So thinking about what are they wearing? And then how are we talking to them about it? This particular person, he didn't even seem to notice that this was problematic. Like, he was kind of living in his own head and didn't notice that people around him were both curious and alarmed. And so there had to be some good education for him on public and private, on sexuality generally, on erections. Laura Magnuson says that could cause issues with toileting for even adults with fine motor issues. It could. And so you have to, there's no one size fits all solution, right? It's all has to do with the individual you're working with. None of this fits everybody. So for sure, you want to be aware of the what other impacts is this solution going to have? And sometimes we have to be more creative. So you're right. If you have somebody in a heavy pair of jeans, but they can't undo the button and the zipper, that's going to be a problem. We need to think of something else. Maybe compression underwear would be the answer in that case. We can be creative, but we have to do something because this can't continue, right? This isn't appropriate.
Can I ask a question about this?
Sure.
All right. So if the young man, this is happening, it seems like there's a need for the sexuality education for him and for everyone else to better understand what is happening with his body and what are ways to manage that when you're in a public space, and what are ways to manage it if you're with someone like the other people, and what are the ways to handle that. So because if that young man was educated, might that behavior dissipate because he would have a better understanding of what was going on?
Exactly, Barbara. If he had had prior education about his body, about public and private, we might not have had this problem at all. In this case, you also bring up another point. The other people need to be educated. So in this case, actually, the staff asked me to also do a sexuality training for the parents, because what we wanted them to do was be able to have conversations about this. We were recognizing that a lot of clients in that class had no idea what was going on when that young man had an erection. There needed to be some good education around that. So we were going to do this kind of training for the parents. And I think we had 12 adults in the group, and I think 3 parents came to the training. So it can be hard, which is why I appreciate everybody who's here today. But that doesn't mean we don't do it, right? So we did it for 3 parents, making a little headway, and then we try to offer it again to see if we can get some more people on board when those parents don't come back and say, oh my God, that was awful. She said penis. All right, concept 2, boundaries. Safety is increased when everyone is clear on the rules and expectations, right? Which means that we not only have to make our expectations clear in our relationships, we have to do direct teaching about rules and boundaries in different kinds of relationships, what the expectations would be. We want to give people language so that they can be clear about their boundaries and their expectations, right? And it has to go in 2 directions ultimately. So I don't know if any of you have used the Circles curriculum. I've never actually used the whole curriculum, but I love the visual that comes with it. You can put the individual's, name in the middle, and then there's a circle for family and intimate relationships. There's a circle for extended family and friends. There's staff and acquaintances. There's strangers. You can modify this 100 different ways to match the person's life. Sometimes we have, you, family, other relationships, like intimate relationships, friends, staff and acquaintances. Sometimes we call them helpers. Like, what if they go to the grocery store and every time they're at the grocery store, they chat with the same cashier? Is that cashier their friend, or is that an acquaintance? Sometimes you add like a helper ring. Therapists, teachers, and staff sometimes get their own ring, because therapists can have pretty intimate relationship with the person, not sexually, but in terms of touching and in terms of sharing. If that person feels very close to you and they share all their information to you, hopefully you have good boundaries and you're not sharing all of your information back. And maybe that's a distinction that we're making. But we also have staff, for example, in group homes, who refer to themselves as family or as friends, and now we're going to get blurry relationships. So using this to sort of define relationships can be helpful. Kim Mears says, we use circles but modify it for different ability levels. Helps take abstract concepts and translate to concrete. It also talks about the trust, touch, and talk you have with each other. It's great, Kim. That would, if you have something that you can share with this group also, that would be great, because it sounds like you've done a lot of work with this. I just think it's such an important, this is such a great tool because you can use it to talk about so many things. But again, we want to be talking about them up front, not after there's a problem. We also need to talk about them if there's a problem, but hopefully we're having these discussions up front, and this is a great way of talking about them. All right, I'm going to skip that one just because we have to move, because we want to have time for discussion. Respect, teach, and model healthy relationships. So we always want to be respecting relationships, right? We don't want to be, here's a problem that I see often, is that we spend a lot of time teasing people about their relationships. They get a crush on somebody, right? They get a crush on the cashier at the grocery store, and we're like, oh, there's your girlfriend, oh, right? First of all, that's not respectful. But second of all, what's the message we're giving, right? What's the message we're giving about that? We want to really respect that people have a strong desire for relationships, and we want to support them in developing healthy and appropriate relationships, right? So we want to respect, we want to be respectful about relationships. We want to teach about relationships in terms of touch and boundaries and defining relationships. And then we want to model them. So we're always, for example, asking before we touch. We're always saying when somebody's too close, right? If my son, grabs me without asking first, I'll be like, oh, sweet pea, you didn't ask, right? And so we want to model, we want to teach, but we also want to be really respectful of relationships and not quite so infantilizing about them. We want to teach that relationships go in 2 directions, right? A relationship requires 2 people. They have to go in 2 directions. And so I may be attracted to that person, but they may not be attracted to me. And that kind of breaks my heart. But I can't have a relationship with that person if they're not interested in me, right? Friendships are hard because, even friends get mad at each other. And sometimes my friend is mad. Does that mean I have to hate them now? Does that mean that they hate me? No, sometimes friends have arguments. Sometimes they disagree. Sometimes they hurt each other's feelings or disappoint each other. What makes a healthy relationship? It's not a healthy relationship that doesn't sometimes struggle. It's the extent to which that relationship can repair itself when it struggles, right? That's what a healthy relationship is. And so, I can't so often like, well, she called me, a jerk. So now she's not my friend anymore. Well, is she not your friend, or did she just hurt your feelings? Did you talk to her about calling you a jerk? Or, we want to teach relationship repair as much as we teach relationship building. The topic of consent is really hard. It's really complex. This is from a curriculum that was written by the UIC Developmental Disabilities Family Clinic and Sexuality Consortium. And what it talks about is the need for, like, there's two parts to consent. You need to get an active yes, right? If you want to touch somebody, you have to ask. You have to get a response, right? You don't just ask and then move in. You've got to ask and wait for a response in whatever communication that person uses. And that you have to have a yes, and it has to be freely given, right? And so there's no lies, threats, pressure, coercion, or blackmail, intimidation, or force. So those are really big words. Those are kind of big concepts, but they're really important. And so, sometimes depending on the person, I can just define those words and we can talk about them. Other times, those concepts are going to be too big. And so sometimes I say, you can't make somebody have sex, and no tricking or trading for sex, right? So I'll go with the tricking or trading. And I've had a lot of instances where there's kind of trading for sex or touch. I'll let you do this if you let me do that. I'll let you play with my Xbox if you'll let me, touch you. So it's really important. And finding your ways of explaining that to your person is important. And you want the two pieces there. You want that active agreement that this is going to be okay. And then it can't come with any attachments or any force or trickery. Determining somebody's ability to consent is very hard. There's all kinds of different ways that people do that, but I think some of the considerations that one wants to take into account when thinking about consent. Let's see. Katie Frank, who actually is an expert on healthy sexuality at the Adult Down Syndrome Clinic at Lutheran General, says there's a variety of visual supports available for individuals with IDD on these concepts at the Adult Down Syndrome Library. And it is a clinic specific to Down syndrome, but I bet these visuals would be applicable for many different disabilities. The resources have been developed based on social skill groups offered there. Please take advantage of that. What a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous resource. Thanks, Katie. And also Katie's a real expert on this topic, so feel free to contact her as well. All right, differing elements used to assess. So these are just some considerations. This is it's a tough one, but does the person have the ability to make rational decisions for themselves? And mostly what we're concerned about is safety, safety for themselves and safety for the other person. Do they have sufficient knowledge and understanding to consider the pros and cons of sexuality? And do they have the ability to say no? Are we actively teaching the ability to say no? And are they aware? Do they understand the other person's ability to say no? Right. So it's tough. This is not easy, but it's really important. And again, I suspect that they've got some really great resources for this at the Adult Down Syndrome Clinic that you could avail yourself of. All right. Biggest risk factors when you're thinking about sexual abuse prevention. social isolation, when somebody hasn't developed like a nice network of social relationships, when they are socially isolated, they're easy targets for predators who will become their boyfriend or their best friend, or show them attention that nobody else will show them, and then be able to groom them into doing things that they shouldn't. The desire for acceptance, right? People just want so much to for people to want them, to like them. I do a lot of work in the area of trafficking. This is how trafficking works, right? A trafficker will just convince somebody that this is how I show love, and you would show me love if you'll then go sleep with other people. But also, I just had a 12-year-old who got so quickly sucked up into an online, unfortunately we caught it before it became dangerous, but clearly an online trafficking situation, because the person at the other end pretended they were also a 12-year-old who liked the same things that this kid liked and had the same struggles. And we can, we're so similar, we could help each other get through this, let's talk, give me your phone number. And it was escalating. And fortunately, mom found out about it before it became too dangerous. But that desire for acceptance is so strong, and a desire for healthy relationships. So are we providing opportunity, teaching about healthy relationships, and then providing opportunity for them? Let's see, Laura Magnus, the biggest concern is authority figures. Son with autism is a rule follower and has been conditioned to listen to adults all through school. Absolutely. And I think one, part of it is we don't want to overstructure our kids in terms of behavior planning, where saying no is seen as defiant or oppositional. So let's be careful about that. Teaching boundaries is so important, because there are appropriate boundaries for authority figures as well. So let's make sure that we're teaching that in all levels of relationship. So barriers to healthy relationship, acceptance, how do we overcome them, right? We accept that our people are going to want relationships, are going to be having relationships. Let's accept that. Let's provide the education, let's provide healthy opportunities, and let's then provide the support. The signals that we give are the most important thing, so that if somebody has questions, they're comfortable coming to us. All right, now's a chance for your questions. I did pretty well. I only went 6 minutes over what I had hoped to go.
You did great. Boy, so much good information. Thank you so much, Susan. I think you've covered every question. If anyone has another question that they want to put in the chat, Susan can answer it now.
It's a really, you try to distill it to 60 minutes, this is just such an overview of a really, really important topic. And it's a topic that we hope sort of takes people from birth to the end of life, right? That people are experiencing healthy relationships, that they're experiencing their body in a healthy way. And that education and learning and support and acceptance can start when they're little and last across a lifetime, right? One thing that's so interesting to me is, that there's a huge outbreak of sexually transmitted diseases in nursing homes. I think we also have this idea that senior citizens don't have sex, and it turns out they do. It's these assisted living communities. I'm just telling you. All right, are there video resources or curriculum you would recommend, something that can be watched on an iPad? Honestly, Katie, do you have video resources on that in your library? Let's see if Katie Frank will pop in. There are curricula out there, the Flash curriculum. Most of them are designed. We only have a video on appropriate touch. Really important, so maybe everybody could look that up. Is sterility a big problem for autistic boys? No, it is not. As far as I know, it is no more of a problem for boys with autism than it is for typically developing kids. My 15-year-old daughter shuts down when I start to talk about this. How do I know how hard to push? Well, she and every other 15-year-old girl than their mother. My God. I think you do your best, but what if you provide visual materials for her? I don't know what her level is, but if you can find some nice visual materials, so, and then you could give those for her to read and then say, do you have any questions? That might be a place that might break the ice a little bit. It is hard, but you know, I gosh, at 15-year-olds, I would have melted if my mother started talking about sex. Can you discuss the impact of the pandemic on my experience? I work in a few group homes as well as with individual clients, and the pandemic, I've seen kind of two reactions to it. There is a group of people who've just done so much better with the pandemic because they've been at home. A lot of them because they're no longer in day programs where relationships are such a big issue and cause so much conflict with people. And so there's that group, but there are other people who are just desperately lonely. And one thing we did find, the next question is about what about internet safety, that a lot of people ended up online because they had lost their personal face-to-face relationships. They ended up using a lot more internet time and ended up in some pretty unhealthy situations on the internet. So what about internet safety? There's a fabulous internet site called NetSmarts, NetSmartz, NetSmarts, and it's got all kinds. It's what the actually law enforcement even recommends for the information for parents, children, teenage. They've got different websites for different groups, children, teens, on internet safety, parents. There's even one for people with disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities. So NetSmartz, NetSmarts. 100% look that up, and they'll have a ton of information about internet safety. The way that there's a statistic that says that boys with autism will spend more than 50% of their awake time on an electronic device, and that the way that most predators will meet their victims online is through those giant multiplayer games. And I actually have experienced this with clients over and over again. So you have to be so careful. Go to NetSmarts and look that up. Any suggestions on guidelines and setting limits and boundaries between my son and his girlfriend through online access? The digital age allows much constant engagement, which seems to breed unhealthiness in relationship. It does, because we don't, so many of us generally, certainly so many of our people with intellectual and developmental disability struggle enough with sort of reading nonverbals. But there's something so anonymous about internet exchanges. I think we all experience that, right? Sometimes people will say things on the internet, in an email or in a text particularly, which is kind of impulsive, that they would never say in person. And so we need to be really aware of that and do specific training on online exchanges. I don't know how old your person is or what their level is, but I do suggest a lot of conversation with people around this. I have clients who are trying to text their girlfriends at 3 a.m. and make the phone, you'll see at 3 a.m. there were 15 texts. Are you awake? Are you awake? I'm awake. Are you awake? Are you awake? Hey, why aren't you talking to me? Why aren't you answering me? Are you awake? Right? And then I've had clients who get into kind of stalky behavior online, where there will be 200 texts in a day. I know you're home. I know you got off at work at 6, and I know you're at home, right? And there will be there has to be a lot of conversation around online etiquette and online safety and online relationships. But I will say that my son, who does not have a disability, when he was in 3rd grade, changed his online name to 69 Pimpin' 69. So it's not like, he thought that was cute. I did not. This isn't a problem limited to people with disabilities. and we have thoughts about how we would handle that with typically developing children or adults. But so let's sort of expand that now. All of those areas of learning need to be learned sort of across the spectrum of humans. And you're right, it has bred some unhealthy exchanges. Amaze.org has videos on YouTube. They're intended for kids and teens, but they may be helpful for adults too. Is that for, what's that topic? For amaze.org. Throw that in. Check out this website, ncil.org, resources, sex ed for individuals with IDD. Awesome. I told you, Katie Frank's your gal. Let's see. Net Smarts with the Z on the end.
Okay.
All right. Any other? Oh, Amaze is about healthy relationships. Awesome.
Can I ask a question about if you see your loved one's behavior changing, what are some warning signs that something's going on? And then how do you address it either with their day program or,
Yeah, I think it's such a good question because we do know that the rate of victimization of people with disabilities is significantly higher than, children are with disabilities are sexually abused 3 to 4 times higher. I've seen some statistics even higher than that. Adults with disability are victimized at rates significantly higher, particularly women, but also men. And we have to remember also men. So, and because we know that it's really hard for people to disclose when they've been sexually abused or even physically abused, but particularly sexually abused. We see that in across the population, right? How many currently what people think a lot about is the horrible situation with USA Gymnastics, where the team doctor abused hundreds of girls. And how many of them actually disclosed? Hundreds of girls, but only a few of them ever actually disclosed something that made them horribly uncomfortable, right? Now we have a different group that is less likely to disclose. First of all, because they may not recognize that something's gone wrong, right? Because they didn't have good education around that. They may not know that it's something that they should be able to share, that their parent or caregiver is comfortable talking about, or they've had experiences in the past where nobody believed them when they tried to say something had happened. So now they're not going to tell again. In those cases, what we often see are changes in behavior, right? When people are confused or afraid or just simply not willing to tell, we'll see changes in behavior. And this is what we want to be aware of, right? So what we want to think about is always, in my mind, if we have a sudden change in behavior, first of all, we want to make sure that there's not a medical problem, right? We'll sudden, often, people will have tooth pain or gut pain or headache or be getting sick and they're not able to identify that discomfort in their body. They have a behavioral change. So often we recommend the first thing is take them to a doctor. But we always want to be considering among the possibilities that that their behavior change has to do with somebody hurting them or somebody making them really uncomfortable. And some of the behaviors we watch for are regressive behaviors, right? Has somebody started wetting the bed again? Is somebody sort of acting more like a baby? But are there particular people or places that they're really afraid to go near or hesitant to go near or just refusing to go near again? Are there topics or times when they're showing big behaviors? We want to watch for patterns. But hopefully we've laid a groundwork where we can then have a conversation around why their behavior has changed. To the extent that they're conversational, right? And we could say, there's a lot of reasons why somebody might be having a lot of struggles like you're having. Sometimes it's because they don't feel good and they can't really figure out, and they just don't feel good and they're grumpy, and that's why they have behaviors like that. Sometimes it's because they're just having a bad week. and they're just having a bad, sometimes it's because somebody's making them uncomfortable or somebody's hurting them, and they don't know how to tell me. Is one of these things happening to you, right? And see if we can sort of get a conversation going, and hopefully we've laid a comfortable foundation for conversations around bodies, around relationships, around boundaries, things like that.
And
Right.
then how does one address a concern, a change in behavior with the day program staff? How do you recommend? It's very delicate. And if the loved one is nonverbal, then you really
Mhm.
work with just, off of, the constraints that you have and what your loved one has expressed. How, how do you suggest addressing it? Because it's so delicate and you don't want anyone, you just want to find a way
Yes,
to make everyone safe and
it
secure.
is delicate, but I will, and this is where we want to make sure always that our person's safety is foremost in our mind, right? To the and it's hard. It is hard because I have seen it happen where programs get very, very defensive if they feel like there might be an accusation. One, so I think just as delicately as possible, I don't have like a specific answer to that other than to say, here's what I'm seeing at home, and I have a concern. He's not wanting to come here. Have things changed here? Can I come and observe? This kind of thing. Another thing that's important in terms of sexual abuse prevention is it's a preventive approach instead of a reactive approach. It's that we always recommend that you start conversations with your organizations that your person is involved in early, right? What are your rules about touch? What are your rules about one-on-one interactions between staff and individuals, right? What are your rules about one staff and one person being out of sight of other staff? I want to know, right? If my child needs assist in the bathroom, it's only one person in there with him at a time. Do you have foot in, foot out rule where, the staff has to be in and out? Or should there be two, are there always two staff so that no individual in the program is ever left without two people's eyes on them? And right now, of course, we have a staffing shortage everywhere, and this is getting harder. But one thing about having those conversations and getting clarity on what policies exist at the agencies you work with is that, first of all, you're saying to the agency, you expect them to have policies, right? That safety is important. And sometimes they start developing policies because a parent approached them about it. But in addition, predators are looking for the person who they don't have to worry about, right? And we can't keep everybody safe, but we can make our kids safer. And if you're the mom who's asking questions, and if you're the mom who's saying, like, what are the policies here? You're saying, I'm watching, right? This is something I think about. This is something I'm watching. And the truth is, you're making your child a little safer, because yours is not the kid that some predator within the program wants to take advantage of, because you're the mom who keeps an eye, right? So trying to be preventive in that way, as well as sort of having thoughts about how to have that conversation. It is a tough conversation.
And it would be helpful if day program staff, I'm sure we have a great day program in our area, but just in general, I don't even know, and I need to learn this. It shows my ignorance that I need to know, we should all know if the staff are trained in asking permission when they have to assist someone in whether it's hygiene, wiping their mouth, wiping their bottoms, all of those things. That is their staff training to really follow that respect of a person's body and space
Yes.
and how to
Yeah.
communicate.
It's really important, and it's particularly tough right now with the staff shortages and constant turnover. So we do the best we can do, right? And that's what we should all just be doing, just doing the best we can do and not kicking ourselves too much, just moving forward.
Right. And we're so grateful to have such good, you know, good date programs, and grateful for the staff who care so much about our loved ones. But these are things, especially when someone is nonverbal, that it's important as a parent to understand better the layers of safety and training that go on behind the scenes.
Yes,
Mhm.
I think that's really important. I know Special Olympics, for example, only just developed a training for staff on the topic. I was involved in developing the training with them, and I was kind of surprised that they're only just now doing it, considering what a big organization they are. But at least they're doing it. We're all just moving forward. So we're doing the best we can do.
Sure.
Any other questions anyone has, or are we good? I want to thank Susan so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. We are recording the session, so we'll get that shared as soon as we can. I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, and all the others. We appreciate it, and we will be back again with Friday Forums in January. So thank you so much to everyone. Any other last questions? It doesn't look like it. So thanks so much for sharing your day with us. We appreciate your time. Thank you.